The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
It was pain that knocked upon my door and said that she had come to stay. And though I would not welcome her, but bade her go away, she entered in. And like my own shade, she followed after me. And from her stabbing, stinging sword, no moment was I free. Some nightmares you wake up from, some nightmares you wake up to. There are troubles that just won't go away. They plague us till our own wretched souls are bruised with adversity. And to some extent, I think that describes every one of us at certain points in our life. All of you have been bruised by adversity, and some of you recently. David said, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous." Job said, "Man's days are short-lived and full of turmoil." Paul said, "We are perplexed, persecuted, cast down." If we were to trace the journeys of Paul in the first century, it would be like tracing the path of a wounded deer, one bloody mark after another as he runs from the hunter. Peter said, "Think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you." The Bible is replete with illustrations of the reality of hurt and trouble as the drum of man beats out the pulse of pain. A jeweler gives as one of the surest tests for a true diamond the water test. I'm told that an imitation stone is not as brilliant as the genuine, but sometimes you can't tell by looking. A genuine diamond sparkles brilliantly even when it's underwater, while the imitation is practically extinguished as to its sparkle. Many of us who are confident of our faith, when we find ourselves under the water of sorrow or affliction, find that our faith does not show forth as brilliantly as we might have hoped. But you put true, solid faith under that same water, and it shines forth just the same as ever. That's why G.K. Chesterton said, "I believe in getting into hot water. I think it keeps you clean." There is a need in our lives for a testing. Sometimes there's no better test than hot water, the water of sorrow and trials. And how we handle this is an indication of our faith. Because we experience trouble constantly. Seems like it's never far away. Job said, "Man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward." Just as surely as the sparks come off a fire and go up, so trouble comes into our lives. So the psalmist said in Psalm 22:11, "Be not far from me, for trouble is near me." The writer of Ecclesiastes said, "Therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit." Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7:28 that if you get married, you'll have trouble in the flesh, because you have trouble just being you. And when you're trying to be you with somebody else who's trying to be them, Paul says there will be trouble. Jesus said, "In this world you will have tribulation," and Jesus himself was troubled in spirit. John 13:21. Paul said he was troubled on every side. So we expect trouble. If you think you're the only one going through it, you haven't been looking around lately. If my faith is no good for trouble, it's no good. If my faith is only good when I don't need it, I don't need it. If my faith is only good when all is well, it's not well. In that chapter that Mason read for us a moment ago in the second verse, James talks about various trials, variegated, multicolored, polka-dotted is the idea, emphasizing the diversity of the troubles that we face rather than just the number of them. They come in all shades, sizes, and varieties. And James says, when, not if. When you fall into various trials, because they are as inevitable as taxes and death, as Mark Twain said. I heard a story about a man on his way home in New York City on a subway. You may have heard this story. Probably you have. This man was prone to motion sickness to begin with, and he'd had a big lunch. And he'd worked all afternoon already with a bit of an upset stomach. And he was jammed into the subway as the last person able to get on, and the door closed, and he was there in the doorway of this subway with the door closed, facing out the window as everything went by at 90 miles an hour. And the longer he stood there, the sicker he got, until finally they came to a stop that was not his place to get off, but there was another man waiting on the platform at the head of the line to get on. And the door opened, and out came the first man's lunch all over the first man standing in line to get on the subway. And the door shut then, and the train went right on. And the man on the platform, suddenly covered with the first man's lunch, turned around to the man behind him in line and said, "Why me?" And isn't that so often our reaction? Why me? Why this? Why now? But James says that these trials are inevitable. If the subway door doesn't open on you this time, then get ready, because it will open on you at some point in the future. And he also says that these trials have a purpose. In verse 3, he says that the trying of your faith worketh patience, that is, a steadfast endurance. There are specific tests to stretch us spiritually. And trials teach us how to hang in there when it doesn't seem like there's any good answer. Now, some of us get in the habit of taking trials as personal offenses. But if we can learn to look at them as servants to teach us something, we'll be way ahead. Our faith is tested like a rubber band is tested, and that is by stretching. In these trials, we learn to be a little more flexible. We learn to give a little where we didn't before. And by and by, the Lord hopes that we will learn to be patient under the load. In verse 3 there in James 1, he talks about your testing or your trying. And the word is dokimos in the Greek language, which refers to approval. Many of the jugs and pots that we've dug up from first century times were marked with that word, dokimos. It's an expression of approval of a vessel that has gone through the furnace without cracking. The vessels were obviously fired in the furnace, or they wouldn't be good for anything. And the ones that cracked in the furnace were placed on the bargain basement shelf because they weren't worth much. They were sold for very little. But the ones that were valuable were those who had gone through the fire of the furnace and were marked approved when they came out without cracking. In a similar sense, a swimming instructor works with the children all summer, teaching them to swim, and finally the day of testing comes. And the instructor puts the child in the water, not to see him sink so he can disapprove him, but to see him swim successfully so that he can pass him. In verse 4, James says, let endurance have its perfect result. Just like stacking up a row of dominoes and you push over the first one, and the first one hits the second one hits the third one. It's like that, as James expresses it. The finger of testing pushes down the first one. When endurance goes down, then it bumps onto the beginning of maturity. And if maturity stays on course, then the dominoes all go down and you become a person of deep Christian character. The great Christian characters that you and I know are people who have learned to handle life in the furnace. The mother who is able to say, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The father who comes home from work, having done the very best that he could, but having lost his job anyway, who says to his family, let's thank God for this opportunity to trust Him. The teenager who says, I'm not going to give up my Christian principles. I'm going to maintain my godly standards, even though right now it feels like I'm just not liked by anybody. This marvelous quality of maturity begins to emerge when we are patient under the load. So we can think of troubles as an enemy and become quite perplexed about that. Or we can think of troubles not as an enemy so much, but as a servant for patience and ultimately for character development unto maturity. I want to know how I can rise above my situation. I don't want to drop out or quit or stop short. What is it that's going to help me in troubling circumstances? How can I become that winner down in verse 12 of the first chapter of James, who happily receives the crown of life? When I go through a trial, I need to examine how I react to that trial and what that says about my faith and what it says about my love for God, which he also talks about at the end of verse 12. Loving God supremely is a key to enduring the trials of life. Them that love God is a title for Christians, like in Romans 8, where he talks there about all things work together for good to them who love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. It's love that holds them fast. If I, in my supposed love for God, don't have any ultimate regard except for my own happiness, if I delight in God not for what he is, but for what he is to me, in such a sentiment, there's really no solid virtue. There is indeed a great love of self, but there's not a deep love of God. But when God himself becomes the object of devotion, when God himself is the object of my delighted contemplation, the views of the lover of God are in great measure diverted from himself when that happens. His soul cleaves to God, and in that affection, we can say with the psalmist, God, whom have I in heaven but thee? As the hart pants after the water brooks, so pants my soul after thee, O God. The bond that ties us to God is love, and it's not just a superficial affection. It's not just a sentiment that is basically selfish. It's not just a sentiment that says, as long as I get what I want from you, God, I'll stick around. But it's a bond of true love that can endure any trial. It behooves us to ask each of ourselves personally, who do I love more than I love God? Abraham had to ask himself that in the 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis. Do I love God more or do I love my son more? Who do I love more than God? Are you pleased with the character of God? Do you love every part of it? Do you love God's holiness as well as his grace? Do you love his justice as well as his mercy? In whose character do I behold more beauty than I do in the character of God? To whom am I more grateful than I am to God? Supreme love for God is decisive evidence of facing in the right direction. How can I gain the most from trials? James gives us in that first chapter, the first few verses there, 3 key means to persevering through and rising above and gaining the most and winning that victory. First is a joyous attitude, James 1:2. My brethren, count it all joy. The word count there means to consider, to evaluate. We have to discipline ourselves to do this. It certainly doesn't come naturally. There's a conscious commitment here. Like the Apostle Paul who said, I have learned. It didn't come naturally. I have learned in whatsoever state I find myself therewith to be content. He says that just after, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. And he said this while he was a prisoner. And to be a prisoner in Rome was not like being a prisoner in America, where you're given 3 square meals a day and television and computer hookups and all that. In Rome, they didn't even feed you. If you wanted to eat, your friends needed to bring you something to eat. Paul was in a stinking, rotten prison where he didn't deserve to be, but he still said, count it all joy. He cultivated that contentment. It didn't happen by accident. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall. This word expresses the idea of something that is unplanned or surprising or even shocking. It's used when Paul's ship fell into a place between 2 seas in the book of Acts. It's an inadvertent occurrence. And there's no way out because these things surround you. Jesus didn't seek trouble, but he accepted it when it came. Hebrews 12:2. Who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. He looked beyond the trial to the joy to be realized after the trial. In other words, to what the enduring of that trial would accomplish. And so we're told in that same chapter, verses 10 and 11, that no chastening for the present seems to be joyous but grievous, but nevertheless afterwards, not at the time, but afterwards, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Sometimes it's quite a bit afterwards, but it comes afterwards. So we count it a privilege to have our faith tested. And we anticipate what the perfecting work is that can be done through that trial. And we learn to cultivate that right attitude. Jesus said that His disciples should not expect anything different than what He Himself had endured. If they hated me, they're going to hate you, He said. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. So we look beyond the trial to the joy that will come after we have passed the test. And notice there that the attitude is not partial joy. It's all joy. Having come to a settled conviction that we're going to face trials with the right attitude. Maybe you've noticed that in your trials you become more aware of God. Maybe prayer increases. Maybe your study of the Bible increases. Paul in jail said, I do rejoice and I will rejoice. Job said, when God has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. Now by that time, with his friends afflicting him, Job was starting to brag a little bit and speak unadvisedly with his lips. But he said that, and it was still true, even though maybe he shouldn't have said it, it was still true. When He has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. Job had quite a bit of confidence in himself there. But he's talking there about the annealing process that takes place a little bit at a time to purify metal. Job even said, though He slays me, still will I trust Him. And his wife was in the wings saying, why don't you just curse God and die? And she became a part of his trials rather than a part of his joy. In Romans 8:18, the apostle said that the sufferings of this present time are not even worthy to be compared with the joy which shall be revealed in us, the glory that shall be revealed in us. Kind of like the guy that was beating his head against the wall because it felt so good when he stopped. Similarly, when we finally get out of this world, it's going to feel awfully good when it's all over, isn't it? Our values determine our evaluations. If you and I value comfort more than character, then trials are always going to upset us. If we value the material more than the spiritual, we will not be able to count it all joy. If we live only for the present and forget the future, then trials will make us bitter, not better. If we can't rejoice in our trials, our values are wrong. If we can't rejoice in our trials, our values are just flat wrong. Pressed out of measure and pressed to all length, pressed so intensely it seems beyond strength, pressed in the body and pressed in the soul, pressed in the mind till the dark surges roll, pressure by foes and pressure by friends, pressure on pressure till life nearly ends, pressed into loving the staff and the rod, pressed into knowing no helper but God, pressed into liberty where nothing clings, pressed into faith for impossible things, pressed into living a life in the Lord, pressed into living a Christ life outpoured. We need to face it in a godly way with a joyous attitude. That's number one. And number two is with an understanding mind. That's verse 3, James 1:3. Second word there is knowing. Knowing that the trying of your faith worketh patience. Knowing speaks of cognition. It speaks of the mind. Know that what's going on in your trials is producing something beneficial. Know that you're being tested, and that the verification of true faith is a wonderful thing. Don't ever think that trials don't accomplish something. Know that they do, James says. And the test is not for your bad, it's for your good. The swimming teacher doesn't want the child to drown. He wants the child to pass the test, but he has to test him so the child can pass the test. The potter doesn't say, let's see how much heat it can take before it cracks. No, he looks in and says, great, it's not cracking. I hope it doesn't crack. When the furnace cools down and he lifts it out with pleasure and holds it up, it is approved. It's marked dokimos. I quoted to you from David a while ago who said, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but I didn't finish the verse. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers. And David actually came to look at King Saul as a tool to teach him something. It's quite an attitude. Trials are tools to teach us endurance, staying power, perseverance, the tenacity of spirit that holds on under pressure. And every time you successfully pass through a trial, you are strengthened. Remember, we have that song that says, each victory will help you some other to win. That's true. You've gained a little more endurance. And James says, know that. Know it. Psalm 40, verse 1. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined unto me. He heard my cry. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet on a rock. He established my going, and He put a new song in my mouth. Isn't that the way you feel when you've come through? Stronger than ever because of the enduring of the trial. So Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10:13, that there is no trial which has taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above that which you are able to bear. Does everybody have the same ability to endure trials? Does everybody in this room have that same ability? Absolutely not. A brand new baby Christian is not going to have the same ability to bear it as some of the rest of us should. But God promises us that He will never allow any one of us to face a trial which we cannot handle. Somebody said, well, God must think I'm an awful lot stronger than I think I am. And that may be true. But remember that the more difficult the battle, the sweeter the victory is when it's won. In the 11th chapter of Hebrews, we find that by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. Why? For he had respect unto the recompense of reward. Moses had an understanding mind, just as James enjoins upon us. Moses knew what enduring the afflictions would bring in the future. Moses endured the wrath of the king because by faith he saw an invisible king. By faith, we have an understanding mind. Third and last, James says that we need a submissive will. So the first word in verse 4 is let. Let. Let endurance do what God wants it to do. Here is a command demanding submission. Actually, it's the second word in verse 4. But let, patience, in the 1769 King James. Let endurance do what God wants it to do. The only way out of a trial is through it. There's no exit in any direction. The only way out of a trial is through it. You can't go over it, under it, or around it. Even if you commit suicide, you do not escape the knowledge. You'll wake up in the next world with the same knowledge. Even if you try to stay drunk all the time, it won't work. The only way out of a trial is through it. There are no side exits. The way out is through. Psalm 131. Surely I have behaved and quieted myself as a child that is weaned of his mother. My soul is even as a weaned child. What I've been through has made me grow. I've matured. I'm off the bottle. And maturity is the goal. So James says, let endurance lead to that. The term for perfect there in the King James Version is used in secular sources of animals that are full grown. And here it's used of Christians who are full grown, which is possible for us to be full grown Christians. Paul says in Philippians 3:15, let us therefore as many as are mature. That shows that he believed by inspiration that there were mature Christians in the Philippian congregation. Maturity is not just a pipe dream. We can all get there. It is attainable. The Lord is trying to bring us all there. Perfect carries the idea of a richness of character, not sinless perfection, but a richness of character. And it also conveys the idea of a balance, a stable, balanced righteousness. That you may be perfect and entire. The word for entire is our word for holography, which is a 360-degree picture. We were talking last night with some people about riding on roller coasters. Sometimes at the end of the roller coaster, they have a picture of you, and whoever's sitting next to you on the roller coaster, and in between you, there'll be a picture of a ghost or something. You've seen that? They try to sell it to you at the end of the ride. That's holography, holographic pictures. That's the word here for the word entire, where all the portions are intact, fully complete, lacking nothing, mature in Christ. 1 Peter 5, verse 10. The God of all grace, after you have suffered a while, will make you perfect. In the 48th chapter of the book of Jeremiah, verse 11, the statement was made there that Moab hath been at ease from his youth. A life without problems produces a very weak character. If your life is just a bowl of cherries and only that all the time, you probably won't grow much. As we go through trials, we are stripped of our worldly dependencies. We're drawn closer to God, and trial after trial, like buckles, are unloosened one at a time so that our dependencies on this world, the things that attach us to this world, are undone bit by bit until by the end of life we should be ready to go. We are shown the character of our faith, and we are perfected to Christ-likeness. Sailors used to say that crosswinds are best for entering the harbor, but it's very difficult to enter the harbor into a direct headwind. They said, and to try to enter with a tailwind can put you 40 feet up on the beach. So crosswinds are best for entering the harbor. You and I are like good metal, or we ought to be. The more we are fired, the more we are refined. The more we are opposed, the more we are approved. Wrongs may try us, and they may touch us, but they cannot imprint upon us any false stamp. Trials cannot destroy our faith. They do test it, though. Sufferings are like little chips off the cross of Christ. I will not doubt, though all my ships at sea come drifting home with broken masts and sails. I shall believe the hand which never fails from seeming evil worketh good to me. And though I weep because those sails are battered, still will I cry while my best hopes lie shattered. I trust in Thee. I will not doubt, though all my prayers return unanswered from the still white realm above. I shall believe it is an all-wise love which has refused those things for which I yearn. And though at times I cannot keep from grieving, yet the pure ardor of my fixed believing, undimmed, shall burn. I will not doubt, though sorrows fall like rain, and troubles swarm like bees around a hive. I shall believe the heights for which I strive are only reached by anguish and by pain. And though I groan and tremble with my crosses, yet shall I see through my severest losses the greater gain. I will not doubt, well anchored in the faith, like some staunch ship my soul braves every gale, so strong its courage that it will not fail to breast the mighty unknown sea of death. Oh, may I cry when body parts with spirit, I do not doubt, so listening worlds may hear it, with my last breath. That's the way to face life, and that's the way to face death, unwaveringly. So, let us accept the trials that produce Christ-likeness, that reveal the state of our faith, that humble us, that wean us from the world, that call us to eternal hope, that teach us what we really love, and that teach us how to help others, and that chasten us into purity. Let us thank God for our trials, and count it all joy, and understand, and submit. Confident that no trial comes to us which we can't bear. The worth of a soldier is never known in time of peace. God had one son without sin, but He has no son without a cross. It pleased the Father to bruise His only begotten Son. Though He were a son, yet learned He obedience by the things which He suffered.